Imagine a person who has everything they need to succeed. The talent is there, the intelligence is there, the opportunity, at some point, in some form, has been there too. And yet, year after year, this person stays exactly where they are. Not because the world has stopped them, not because the doors were all locked, but because something inside them, something quiet, invisible, and extraordinarily powerful, kept whispering, "Not yet. Not now. What if it goes wrong? What will people think?" This person is not a character in a story. You probably know them. You may, in your most honest moments, recognize them as yourself. Fear is the great unspoken force of human life. We talk endlessly about ambition, about goals, about the lives we want to build, but we talk very little about the invisible walls we construct around ourselves, the hesitations we dress up as prudence, the retreats we call wisdom, the silence we call patience, but is really just avoidance. Most people are not defeated by failure. They are defeated long before they fail, by the anticipation of it, by the imagined rejection, the possible embarrassment, the story they tell themselves about what might go wrong if they dared to try. In The 50th Law, Robert Greene and 50 Cent make an argument that is simple on the surface and profound in its implications. The greatest force standing between you and the life you want is not circumstance, competition, or bad luck. It is fear. And the only way through it is to go directly toward it. This video is not a biography. It is not a motivation speech. It is an exploration, careful, honest, and philosophical, of what it actually means to live without allowing fear to make your decisions, what it means to be free. Let's begin. Section 1. The Invisible Prison of Fear. Fear is not always loud. Sometimes it roars, in the panic attack, in the paralysis before a difficult conversation, in the hands that shake before a performance. But those dramatic moments are not where fear does its most consequential work. Fear does its deepest work quietly. It operates in the space between intention and action. It lives in the reasons we give ourselves for not applying for that position, not sending that message, not pursuing that idea, not saying what we really think. It has an endless vocabulary of disguises: caution, realism, timing, responsibility. The psychologist Abraham Maslow spent decades studying human potential. Why some people moved toward their fullest capacity while others, who were equally gifted, seemed to stop short. He discovered something troubling. Most people do not fail to grow because they lack ability. They fail because they face what he called the safety growth choice. At every moment of potential expansion, a person chooses between the familiar safety of what they know and the uncertain growth of what they could become. And the pull towards safety, Maslow found, is almost always stronger. We are, in some sense, wired for fear. The brain's threat detection system, the amygdala, working faster than conscious thought, evolved to keep us alive in a world of genuine physical danger. But we no longer live in that world. The predators we face now are social: judgment, rejection, failure, irrelevance. And yet, our nervous systems respond to them with the same urgency they once reserved for lions. This is why talented people stay invisible. This is why intelligent people hesitate. This is why so many dreams die, not in the wreckage of failed attempts, but in the silence of attempts never made. Greene identifies several specific fears that quietly govern most human lives. The fear of rejection, which keeps us agreeable when we should be honest and silent when we should speak. The fear of failure, which keeps us inside problems we know rather than risking solutions we don't. The fear of judgment, which makes us dress our most authentic impulses in the respectable costumes of what other people expect. And perhaps most paradoxically, the fear of success. The deep, unconscious terror of becoming visible, of being held to a higher standard, of losing the comfortable identity of someone who might have done great things if only they'd tried. Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist who survived 4 Nazi concentration camps and went on to become one of the 20th century's most important thinkers, wrote something that should stop us cold. He said that the greatest danger facing the modern person is not suffering. It is what he called the existential vacuum, the paralysis that comes from having freedom without the courage to use it. He watched people survive the unsurvivable and still, once free, fail to live. Not because the world had broken them, because something internal had. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. Fear colonizes that space. It fills the gap between what happens to us and how we respond with its own agenda, avoidance, contraction, withdrawal. And the longer we allow it to fill that space, the smaller the space becomes, until the gap between who we are and who we could be disappears entirely. The first step toward freedom is simply this: to see the prison, to name the fear, not to eliminate it, but to stop mistaking it for wisdom.
Section 2. Becoming fearless. Let's be precise about what fearlessness actually means, because the popular version of it is wrong, and the wrong version is useless. Fearlessness is not the absence of fear. It is not the privilege of people born with thicker skin, higher tolerance, or less to lose. It is not a personality trait you either have or don't. Fearlessness, in the deepest sense, is a practice, a daily, imperfect, sometimes exhausting choice to act despite the presence of fear rather than in its absence. This is Greene's central argument, and it is the most important idea in the book. Courage is not the elimination of fear, it is the refusal to give fear the deciding vote. Consider Theodore Roosevelt. By almost any measure, the man who would become one of America's most vigorous and expansive presidents was, as a young child, physically frail, asthmatic, and chronically afraid. He was afraid of the dark. He was afraid of being physically overwhelmed. His father told him something that redirected the entire trajectory of his life. "You have the mind, Theodore, but you do not have the body. And without the body, the mind cannot go as far as it should. You must make your body." Roosevelt chose, deliberately and methodically, to build a relationship with difficulty, to seek out the things that frightened him rather than avoid them. He called it living in the arena. It is not the critic who counts. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly. This is not the philosophy of recklessness. Roosevelt was not saying that fear is irrelevant, or that risk doesn't exist, or that we should leap without looking. He was saying that a life spent outside the arena, safe, protected, unchallenged, is not a life at its fullest. In the book, 50 Cent's early life in Southside Queens is used not as a story of violence, but as an illustration of what happens when a person is forced, by circumstance, to confront the reality of their situation without illusion. What Greene observes is that losing the cushion of false safety, the comfortable belief that things will somehow be fine, can be, paradoxically, liberating. When you have accepted the worst that can happen, the worst loses much of its power over you. The Stoics understood this deeply. Marcus Aurelius, ruling the Roman Empire during military campaigns and plague outbreaks, wrote to himself in his private journals, not for posterity, but as daily practice. He reminded himself repeatedly of impermanence, of mortality, of the reality that almost nothing he feared would be as catastrophic as he imagined, and that almost everything he needed to handle was within the range of human capacity. Negative visualization, the Stoics called it, the deliberate contemplation of what you fear. Not to become morbid or paralyzed, but to develop what they called amor fati, love of fate. An acceptance of reality so complete that even difficulty becomes workable. What all of these figures, Roosevelt, Frankl, Marcus Aurelius, share is something Greene names as the core of the 50th law: radical self-reliance. The deep understanding that no external condition, no relationship, institution, reputation, or amount of money can provide the security that comes from trusting yourself. That the only genuine safety is the knowledge that whatever happens, you can respond, you can adapt, you can begin again. This is not arrogance. It is something quieter and more durable, a settled relationship with uncertainty, an understanding that the unknown is not the enemy. It is simply the territory in which all meaningful life takes place.
Section 3. Turn adversity into power. There is a strange alchemy that happens in some human lives. A person encounters something terrible: loss, failure, humiliation, illness, betrayal. And instead of being diminished by it, they emerge from it somehow larger, more themselves, more capable, more clear. We see it often enough that it should make us curious. What is the mechanism? What is the difference between the person who is broken by difficulty and the person who is forged by it? Greene's answer, built carefully across the 50th law, is not about the difficulty itself. It is about the relationship a person chooses to have with it. Nelson Mandela spent 27 years in prison on Robben Island. The conditions were brutal. The injustice was monstrous. And yet Mandela emerged not diminished, but, by almost every account, including his own, more complete. He spent those years studying, reading, thinking, learning Afrikaans, understanding the psychology of his captors. He refused to accept the emotional narrative the situation seemed designed to impose, that he was powerless, defeated, erased. He chose, deliberately and day after day, a different narrative. He was not waiting. He was preparing. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. These words, from William Ernest Henley's poem Invictus, became a kind of personal creed for Mandela, not because they denied the reality of his suffering, but because they refused to let that suffering be the final word. The Japanese swordsman Miyamoto Musashi, considered perhaps the greatest duelist in history, understood adversity differently, but arrived at a similar place. Musashi's life was defined by conflict, hardship, and the kind of brutal clarity that comes from understanding that your next moment might be your last. What he developed through years of that pressure was not recklessness, but something he called the void. A mental state of such complete presence and equanimity that fear lost its grip entirely. He wrote in The Book of 5 Rings, "Do nothing that is of no use. Eliminate everything that isn't essential. What remains is what is real." This is the secret of what Greene calls turning adversity into power. It is not about pretending the adversity isn't painful or that it isn't unfair. It is about asking, even inside the worst of circumstances, What can I take from this? What does this strip away that didn't need to be there? What does this teach me about what I'm actually made of? Failure, specifically, is one of the most misunderstood teachers available to us. We treat it as evidence of wrongness, proof that we should have stayed where we were safe. But failure, looked at honestly, is information. It is the most direct feedback the world can give you about what isn't working. The person who can receive that feedback without ego distortion, without the need to defend against it or explain it away, is the person who actually learns, who actually improves. Steve Jobs was fired from Apple, the company he founded, at the age of 30. By any conventional measure, this was catastrophic. But Jobs later said it was the best thing that ever happened to him. Freed from the weight of success, from the bureaucratic inertia of a large organization, from the identity of being Apple's CEO, he went and built Pixar and Next, and thought more clearly about what he actually wanted to create. When he returned to Apple a decade later, he was a different person. The failure had made him. The fearless mind does not seek out suffering. It does not romanticize hardship. But it does not flinch from reality either. It understands that the attempt to eliminate all adversity is both impossible and counterproductive, because we are shaped by resistance the same way a muscle is shaped by weight. Without resistance, we never discover our actual strength.
Section 4. Independence of mind. There is a kind of pressure so constant, so ambient, so woven into the fabric of daily life that most of us have stopped noticing it. It is the pressure to be comprehensible, to fit within the categories that the people around us already recognize, to want what is normal to want, to say what is safe to say, to build the kind of life that receives nods of approval at dinner parties and doesn't require too much explanation. This pressure is not enforced by anyone in particular. It enforces itself through the accumulation of small signals, small reactions, small moments of warmth when we conform, and coolness when we deviate. We learn, very early and very deeply, that originality is risky, that being different is expensive, that the path of least social resistance is the path everyone can understand. Greene calls this one of the most damaging forms of fear, the fear of social disapproval. And he argues that it is, in many ways, harder to overcome than the fear of physical danger, because it never entirely goes away. Humans are social creatures. The desire for belonging is not a weakness or a character flaw. It is a fundamental part of our nature. But when the desire for belonging overrides the commitment to authenticity, something essential is lost. The philosopher Søren Kierkegaard spent his entire career trying to articulate what he saw as the deepest tragedy of human existence: the life lived on others' terms. He called it the crowd, the vast, comfortable, anonymous social mass that tells you who to be and what to want and how to measure success. And he believed that losing yourself in it was the one true existential failure. Not financial failure, not professional failure. The failure to become, in his words, an individual. The most common form of despair is not being who you are. Independent thinking is not about contrarianism, the reflexive rejection of whatever the crowd accepts. That is just conformity in reverse, still defined by others, still reactive, still not free. Real independence of mind is something quieter and more demanding.
It is the willingness to arrive at your own conclusions through your own process, even when those conclusions are uncomfortable, even when they put you at odds with people you respect, even when they require you to revise something you previously believed. This is what made Marcus Aurelius unusual among emperors, and what makes him still worth reading 2,000 years after his death. He governed an empire, but he never stopped questioning his own assumptions. His meditations are not confident pronouncements. They are a person thinking, carefully, honestly, sometimes painfully, about who he is and what he actually believes and how he wants to live. Not what Rome expected of an emperor. What he, Marcus, thought was true. Greene argues that this kind of independence, what he calls self-direction, is both the goal of the fearless life and its most reliable measure. Not success, not recognition, not the validation of others. The ability to look at your life and see clearly that the choices in it were actually yours. That you built something that reflects who you really are, rather than who you were told to be. Creative courage, specifically, requires this. Every person who has made something genuinely original, a piece of writing, a business, a work of art, a way of living, has had to survive the period before the world knew what to do with them. Has had to hold the conviction that what they were making had value before anyone else agreed. This is among the most demanding feats of psychological endurance available to a human being. And it is only possible for the person who has, at some fundamental level, stopped requiring external permission to believe in themselves.
Section 5. The fearless mind in the modern world. Let's talk about now. Because everything we've discussed, the invisible prison of fear, the practice of fearlessness, the power of adversity, the independence of mind, all of it becomes more urgent, not less, in the specific world we are living in today. We exist in a moment of extraordinary and accelerating uncertainty. The career paths that were stable for previous generations are dissolving. Industries that seemed permanent are being transformed or eliminated by artificial intelligence at a pace no one fully anticipated. The social structures that once provided identity and belonging, religious communities, geographic communities, professional guilds, have fractured. We are more connected than any humans in history and, by many measures, lonelier. And onto all of this uncertainty, we have overlaid a technology specifically designed to amplify comparison. Social media does not merely show us other people's lives, it shows us the curated, filtered, strategically selected highlights of other people's lives, and invites us to measure our unedited reality against their edited performance. The result is a comparison culture of unprecedented reach and intensity, generating anxiety and inadequacy at a scale that would have been literally inconceivable to any previous generation. This is fear operating at the cultural level. Not the fear of lions or starvation, the fears our nervous systems evolved for, but the fear of falling behind, of being left out, of being ordinary in a world where everyone's feed seems to show the extraordinary, of making the wrong choice in an environment where every choice feels potentially irreversible. Greene could not have fully anticipated this landscape when the 50th law was written, but the principles he articulates speak directly to it. Because what social media sells, fundamentally, is the illusion that somewhere out there is a life without uncertainty, a life that has already arrived,
a life that is not in the process of being built, but is complete, radiant, and secure. The fearless mind sees through this illusion. It knows that no life is lived outside uncertainty, that the question is never how to escape it, but how to move through it with your intentions intact. For the individual navigating career uncertainty in an AI era, the principle of radical self-reliance becomes not a philosophical preference, but a practical necessity. The skills that are most resistant to technological displacement are not technical skills. Those can be replicated or replaced. They are fundamentally human capacities, the ability to think independently, to adapt, to build genuine relationships, to create things that reflect a singular point of view. These are precisely the capacities that fearlessness makes possible and fear suppresses. For the person building a creative career, a writer, an artist, a founder, a designer, the independence of mind we discussed becomes the most essential professional asset. In an environment saturated with content, with voices, with brands competing for attention, the thing that cuts through is not polish. It is not volume. It is authenticity. The quality of having something to say that only you could say, in a voice that is genuinely yours. And authenticity is only possible for the person who has stopped performing for approval. The modern world, in other words, has created conditions in which the fearless philosophy is not a luxury for the spiritually advanced. It is, increasingly, the only viable strategy for a life that is actually lived. The mindful reflection. I want to sit with you for a moment before we close, because everything we've talked about can sound, in the abstract, almost too clean, like a philosophy that resolves things neatly. Face your fears, build resilience, think independently, act despite uncertainty, and your life will be free. It isn't that simple. And I think Greene knows it, and I think you know it. The truth is that no philosophy removes fear permanently. No level of self-awareness, no degree of courage, no accumulation of experience makes the uncertainty go away. You will face new fears as you grow. You will lose things you love. You will attempt things that don't work. You will have days, maybe long stretches, when the invisible prison feels very real and the walls feel very close. What changes with practice is not the presence of fear. What changes is your relationship to it. The fearless mind, the mind that has chosen repeatedly and deliberately to act despite fear, develops something the psychologists call self-efficacy, and the rest of us might call a quiet confidence. Not the loud, brittle confidence of someone who hasn't been tested, the settled, earned confidence of someone who has been afraid and moved anyway, enough times to know that they can. Courage, it turns out, is not a reservoir you either have or lack. It is a muscle. It grows in exactly the way muscles grow, through progressive resistance, through the accumulation of small acts of courage that make the next act slightly easier. Every time you say the true thing instead of the comfortable thing, every time you pursue the meaningful thing instead of the safe thing, every time you stay in the arena when retreat would have been easier, you are not just making a decision, you are becoming someone. Someone slightly less controlled by fear than the person who entered that moment. This is the deepest truth in the 50th law. Not a strategy, not a set of tactics, a different way of understanding what a human life is for. Freedom does not begin when the world becomes safe. Freedom begins when fear is no longer allowed to make your decisions. The world will not become safe. There are no guarantees, no certainties, no final arrivals. The uncertainty is permanent. The question is only what you will do inside it. And that question, perhaps the most important question available to you, is one that only you can answer. Not today, once, definitively, but every day, in the small moments where fear presents its case and you choose whether to let it win. The life you want is not somewhere behind the fear. It is on the other side of moving through it.
I want to ask you something, and I'd genuinely love to see your answer in the comments. We've spent this time looking at fear honestly, what it costs us, what it conceals, and what becomes possible when we stop letting it make our decisions. What decision would you make today about your work, your relationships, your creative life, your direction, if fear had no vote? Or if you'd rather go deeper, what fear has been quietly shaping your life, perhaps so quietly that you've been calling it something else? Caution, timing, practicality, realism. Name it in the comments, because naming a thing is the first act of freedom from it. If this video gave you something worth keeping, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't read the 50th Law, I'd encourage you to. It is not always comfortable reading, but very little that is genuinely useful ever is. Thank you for watching. Take good care and take the next step.